Now, Paul also tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, 50 and 51, he tells us in the twinkling of an eye it will take place. That it will happen so fast that people will hardly even believe their eyes when they see that Christians have been changed and now rise in the air. The Bible doesn't give us many details, but we know that when Jesus rose in the air, he was actually seen by the disciples and perhaps other people on the Mount of Ascension. And so perhaps those around us who are not Christians will actually watch us physically arise. The Bible doesn't give us the details. Now, there are many who believe that this idea that the rapture resurrection will take place before the tribulation is an idea that is really a Johnny-come-lately. It's an idea that did not exist before. However, I have found that there is some original research that I was able to complete a number of years ago and found a manuscript from the early Christian church which clearly talked about the pre-tribulation rapture. As an example of the suggestion that there was no teaching of the rapture taking place before the tribulation before very recently, a book that was written, about 1975, talking about the rapture as a kind of cover-up. I quote, it says, before 1830, Christians had always believed in a single future coming. In other words, Jesus would come only once, not once in the air and then once later to the earth. But this man says there was only one belief. He's coming once, and then he says, and the catching up of 1 Thessalonians 4 that we just read about will take place after the Great Tribulation of Matthew 24. He says that was taught universally until 1830. He's referring to the fact that a man by the name of John Darby of the Plymouth Brethren in 1830 began writing extensively about the pre-tribulation rapture. But I'm going to show you that there were others who clearly saw this more than 1,000 years before John Darby in 1830. Another writer in a book in 1980 wrote, people who are teaching the pre-tribulation rapture are teaching something that was never taught before 1812. Not one of the early church fathers taught a pre-tribulation rapture. Well, let me give you the good news. If it is true, the question will be found in the Bible, not in the opinions of man. If the Bible teaches it, it's true, that settles it for me. But it is significant that if it is a true statement of the Bible, that some Christians at some earlier point than 1830 would have seen it. And I've found more than one who did and wrote extensively about it. This was a writing of a man who's found in the post-Nicene Fathers, that series of early Christian writers. This man was known as Ephraim the Syrian. He lived on the Turkish-Syrian border. This man was a major writer, Christian poet. He wrote songs which are still sung in the Orthodox Greek Church today. He wrote very literally about prophecy. And when I read his writings in the post-Nicene Fathers, I wondered if this man had also seen the truth of the pre-tribulation rapture. I discovered he'd written a book that had never, ever been translated into a modern European language. It was written in Syriac, the language of his day, back in 373 AD, 1,700 years ago. Here's what this man wrote in the book that he called On the Last Times, the Antichrist and the End of the World, by Ephraim the Syrian, dated AD 373. He talked about the rapture, and he said that it was imminent, and he said, and I quote, "We ought to understand thoroughly, therefore, my brothers, what is imminent or overhanging." He says, "We must prepare ourselves for the meeting of the Lord, so that he may draw us from the confusion which overwhelms the world." He used the word confusion as a synonym for the tribulation. Here is the quote that I want to draw your attention to. "For all the saints and the elect of God are gathered prior to the tribulation that is to come, and are taken to the Lord, lest they see the confusion that is to overwhelm the world because of our sins." If that's not a pre-tribulation statement, I don't know what is. A friend of mine took that statement after I discovered it, and he sent it to a number of theologians and did not tell them where it was originally written. He asked them, "What do you make of that statement?" These men, though themselves not pre-tribulationists, stated, Well, that's a writing by someone who obviously holds the pre-tribulation rapture position. They were stunned when they found that this was a 1,700-year-old statement from Ephraim the Syrian, proving that the pre-trib rapture is not some late idea, not some new theological notion in the last 2 centuries, but in fact was discovered back in the early centuries of the early Christian church. There are a number of other writers in the 1700s who also talked about it. Joseph Mead, in his book, The Key to Revelation, wrote first and described this event as the rapture. Now, some have complained that the word rapture is not found in the Bible, but Jerome in 385 AD translated, caught up with the Latin word in his Latin translation as rapere, to be caught up, and that word ultimately was translated into a noun in the English, rapture. What are the reasons why we can have confidence that we are going to be raptured before the tribulation and the Antichrist? First of all, in 1 Thessalonians 1:10. In that verse, what do we find? The Apostle Paul, speaking about this very thing to the church at Thessalonica, says the following: "We are to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, which delivered us from the wrath to come." 1 Thessalonians 1:10. Now listen to the sequence. We're to wait for his Son from heaven. That's the rapture, a future event. Whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus. And then he says, which delivered us from the wrath to come. So a future event, Christ coming for us in the air, will deliver us from a yet more future event, the wrath to come. Now the wrath to come is clearly the tribulation wrath of God. In Revelation chapter 6, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse begin the 7-year tribulation period. Those 4 things that are involved in the 4 horsemen: the 2nd horseman of war, the 3rd horseman of famine, the 4th horseman of plague and wild beast attacking mankind. Those 4 things are called in the prophet Ezekiel in multiple places in the Old Testament, over a dozen times. They're called God's 4 severe judgments, the wrath of God. It's clear this is the wrath of God. And in 1 Thessalonians 5:9, the Apostle Paul tells us clearly that God has not appointed us unto wrath, but unto salvation. You can examine the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and you will not find a single instance where God has ever once poured his wrath upon the righteous. Even in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, when Abraham argued with God and said, well, if there be 50 righteous men there, or if there be 40, if there be 30, and there weren't even 10. But Abraham said, shall not the God of all the earth do right? In other words, he challenged God that he would not destroy the righteous with the unrighteous. And the angels said to Lot, when they came into the city, you and your family must leave, because until you leave, we cannot destroy this wicked city. God never indiscriminately destroys the righteous with the unrighteous. If the righteous were still on earth, then the wrath of God of Revelation could not be poured out, because it goes 1/3 of all the vegetation is destroyed, 1/3 of the waters are turned to blood. This would obviously destroy the 500 to 1 billion righteous Christians throughout the world. Also, when we look, we find that in Revelation 7:1-8, God supernaturally causes the angel to seal for divine protection 144,000 righteous Jews. Now, 2 chapters later, in chapter 9, the satanic locusts are released from the bottomless pit, and they sting everybody on earth except the 144,000 who have the seal of God. They are stunned so that they wish they could die, but they cannot for 5 months.